Our next speaker, our second speaker, is Allison Lin, who's the Director of AI and Innovation Communications at Microsoft. She formerly was the economics and financial journalist for NBC News Today Show and CNBC. Her responsibility includes overseeing two Microsoft storytelling platform, AI Blog and Innovation Stories Hub. They create original content about the work Microsoft is doing in areas such as AI, mixed reality, and quantum computing, as well as the groundbreaking achievements coming out of the company research lab. At Microsoft, she also leads a team responsible for journalism-style storytelling about the most compelling work the company is doing in artificial intelligence, research, and innovation. She provides strategic guidance to stakeholders across the company, and her goal is to help mainstream journalists, influencers, and tech enthusiasts understand the latest technology advances, including quantum computing, AI, and cryptography. And she will talk to us about how to tell your innovation story for you and your clients.
Awesome. It's always so super awkward to hear people talk about you. So, but I am really excited to be here and thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see this presentation?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So from what I understood from the Silicon Valley Innovation Center, you all were interested in hearing a little bit about the how of telling your innovation story and also the why of telling your innovation story. So just to kick off quickly, I want to say, first of all, I do work at Microsoft. Most of my experience in this space is at Microsoft, but I am speaking personally today based on my observations. So I'm not speaking for the company, just so that's clear, something we always like to say when we are out talking to folks.
Is this our Azure network right here?
Pardon me?
I said, is this our Azure network right here, this picture?
This is actually Project Natick, and it is an underwater data center, and it is a picture of us cleaning it after we pulled it out of the water from being underwater for 3 years. So yeah, it is a network, but not one that you're using right now.
Hopefully.
Anyway, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important to tell your innovation story, especially if you're a company that's going through a digital transformation, which candidly, I think every company is right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to tell your story and get people excited about it, especially internal folks who can sometimes be your most challenging stakeholders to get excited about this kind of thing. I'm going to talk a little about the impact you can see internally, externally, some tips and tricks for telling your story, and how to get your story out into the world. And hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions. I'll try to keep my part short because I love questions. And also, if folks just want to jump in with questions, feel free to. Definitely want to make sure that this time is valuable to you. And let's see if my screen will change. There we go. Okay. So, I think that in addition to my work at Microsoft, I work with a lot of customers and partners, and I would say that literally every company that I know of is going through some sort of digital transformation. And a lot of folks, I think, are kind of questioning, like, why would we talk about this? This is really hard work. Change is hard. Like, change is hard for anybody. Losing 5 pounds is hard. Moving your house is hard. Any change is hard. Digital transformation is especially difficult, especially if you're talking about the kind of digital transformation that so many companies are doing, where it's internal transformation. We were talking about teams, like maybe it's getting your folks onto new technologies, getting them to embrace things they haven't done in the past, and external, trying to push new products, things like this. Like, this is really hard. And I do understand the idea of thinking like, oh, why would we talk about this? Like, why would we air what can potentially feel a little bit risky? And I think the first thing I would say about that is, if you don't tell your innovation story, it's going to be told for you. So if you have employees in the company who you're trying to bring into using new tools and using new technology, and you're kind of like, not communicating a vision, not communicating a story to them, that story might be like, "Ugh, I don't like this, I don't feel empowered," whatever. So you don't want your employees to tell that story for you in a negative way. You want to help them understand your journey. Externally, it's the same thing. If you're suddenly putting out a bunch of new products or doing a bunch of things, and it's not clear what your long-term plan is, that story might be getting told for you and not in the way that you want it. So I think the way that you communicate your story is really important for building employee excitement, bringing your employees along on the journey, and for building that external engagement, whether it's for hiring and recruitment, which is obviously really important, whether it's for getting new customers and partners excited, and also, for the media folks that I think about a lot. I think also, just to talk a little bit more about that employee side. One thing that we've seen with both our internal and external innovation storytelling is it can be a real morale booster. If people feel like they're doing this hard work, but it's paying off and they're getting recognized for it, it really encourages that kind of virtuous cycle of innovation. It really encourages that idea of trying new things. It really makes them feel like it's worth it to be on this journey versus, like, ugh, now I have to learn how to use Teams or whatever. So like, I'm the one now that keeps calling on Teams as a challenge, but it's really not. I think also the great thing about telling your innovation story is it's an opportunity to show authenticity. So one thing that we see in the world right now is that folks want to feel like they have a peek behind the curtain, whether it's celebrities who feel the need to share their entire therapy sessions with the world on Twitter, or whether it's a company who, is letting you, like in our case yesterday, we launched a story that lets people go into our data centers and see what they look like. That's the kind of culture we live in today. So kind of, standing back and saying everything's perfect, everybody's perfect, it just doesn't really work as a sort of a corporate vision right now. So when people put out these like formal press releases with these canned quotes and things like that, that just doesn't feel modern, and I don't think it's effective. So I think telling your story, even if it's an imperfect story, is an opportunity to be authentic. Go to my next little slide here. So, in addition to kind of telling your story, I think it's really important to figure out what your story is. And this is something that I do honestly see companies make mistakes in a lot. They're like, hi, we're being innovative. Hi, we're doing this, but it's not a really clear narrative. So like here at Microsoft, there's a million cool things happening, right? We have 160,000 employees, and I hear from them all the time telling me like, hey, we've got this great research innovation, or engineering is doing this, or I get a lot of like, we're bootstrapping a cool project. Can you write about it? And like, unfortunately, a lot of my job is saying no. And it's not because the work isn't cool. It's because we're owning a very specific innovation story. And, for us, a lot of that is like, how do we further our mission at Microsoft? How are we furthering this mission of, helping every person and organization on the planet achieve more? There's also certain themes that we want to hit again and again. So these are examples of stories that really fit into the top themes for Microsoft. Data center innovation. Data centers are a core priority for us as a company. They're a core priority for our customers. People are entrusting us with their data. We want to show them how seriously we take that and how much we want to use our data centers as a path forward in innovation. Mixed reality is a space that we talk about a lot because it's really like a differentiating space for us. And it's a complicated space to explain. AI, obviously a very important space for us. And so we're gonna talk about that again and again in a lot of ways. The other thing I wanna say about this story that we own, when we own our innovation story, we always think about how we can also include a customer and partner. It's very, very rare for me to tell a story about something we did without talking about how we brought a customer or a partner in on its journey. So when you're thinking about owning your story, when you're thinking about defining your story, I would really encourage you to think about like, how is our innovation story benefiting our customers and partners? And how can we show that with our work? How often can we make it a story about them, not us, where we're the player innovating their success or enabling their success? So a few things to say about this. When you're thinking about the right customer or partner to bring into your story, I really encourage you to think about, is this story going to accrue to their mission? What story are they trying to own? And how can we help further those goals? And, being really honest with folks, because sometimes you start that conversation and you realize, what, we want to go here, they want to go there, it's not going to work. I always want to leave an engagement with a customer or partner, having them feel better about our relationship rather than worse. And so if you sense in the early parts, like this isn't going to be that sort of, mutually beneficial experience, that's a great time to be like, thank you so much. Let's, regroup another time. We also really, really work hard to set clear expectations with our customers. So when we are engaging with them, we try to tell them everything from, this is how much time it will take, this is what it will look like at the end, this is what you will be able to control, like literally down to the, like, you can expect 30 minutes for a phone call, 30 minutes for a review session. These are the dates we expect it, because, setting yourself up for success with a partner or customer, I think, is all about reassuring them that they know from the beginning what they're in for. It also helps if things do go awry, that you've, kind of tried your best to set expectations. You've built some goodwill and a culture of respect.
Now, if I could,
Yeah.
which, and maybe you're going to get to this, but which that was helpful on the kind of the selecting the customer side. Do you have any thoughts on how to select which, like you mentioned, there's a lot going on. I'd say BDO is
Yeah.
almost to the same scale as Microsoft.
Yeah.
Not quite. It's a bit of a joke, but certainly there is a lot going on. I mean, between tax practice, assurance, CBR, core business areas, there's a lot going on. How do you narrow in on those projects, I guess?
Yeah. No, it's a really great question. Actually, let me go back to this slide because I can talk about that a little bit. I think that if it'll let me go back. There we go. I think that if there's a few things, that initial conversation with a customer is always really telling. And there's a lot of times where we start the conversation and we realize that the area of the business that they're working on, like maybe they're a customer in like 10 parts of our business and they're a really great customer, but this particular area isn't the right area. So I really do think it's like finding that match between where they're being innovative and you're being innovative. And then that second part is like, are they willing to kind of show that authenticity and take that risk and things like that? So it's almost like a personality fit sometimes. Warner Brothers, this example on, I guess it's the left, I have right and left issues, is a really good example of that. You wouldn't think of Warner Brothers necessarily as a company who would want to tell a data center innovation story with us, but it really turned out as we got to talking to them that they have this big issue of storing historical artifacts. So we had a story to tell about the value of storing data on glass, which is this really innovative way of making sure that records don't degenerate and kind of like go bad. They have the same problem with like literal, like, movies on reels. And so it ended up where at the beginning I wouldn't have said like, oh, Warner Brothers is a natural partner for this. But as we moved along, we realized they were super eager to tell an innovation story about storage. And we were too, which seems like a weird fit. So it ended up being a really great thing. Another thing I would say, and this isn't to discount at all, telling a story with a partner that has a visual storytelling angle is great. I just did some storytelling with FedEx. They're a great partner of ours and they're really fantastic. And it really helps that they have cool airplanes and delivery trucks that we can show. So immediately the reader is like, oh, I know that brand. I understand it. Like, yeah, tell me more. Like that's a company that comes to my doorstep. Does that answer your question or do you have other follow-ups?
No, it does. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, of course. I think are you trying to talk, Buzz? I think you're mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my microphone. Anyway, so in interesting story that you said about like from the very beginning, right? When you're actually saying, is it going to be a cool story to tell? But
yeah,
maybe walking back a little bit to this authenticity point, right? Because I think that almost telling the things that work are as valuable as telling the things that didn't work. So how do you sort of balance this on the one side? You obviously want to tell a great story that worked out and everyone is happy, but then that point of the authenticity where you're trying to address some of those things that might not went as well and what you learned.
Yeah, no, this is such a great question. I think that there's such an impulse in corporate life to present a perfect front. And that makes sense, right? You've got customers, you've got shareholders, you've got employees, and you want them to feel safe. You want them to feel like everything worked out. But we are living in a world where the innovation is happening in such real time that nothing is perfect. And so an example of this is like I don't have a slide for it, but we did a story a few years ago about a sailplane that would move through the air like a bird using AI. And so, follow on the wind. We went out in the desert. We invited a New York Times reporter to come with us live into this. We got there and it was not working. This plane was taking off and like falling on the ground immediately. It turned out there was some metal in the soil that was causing the electronics not to work. We were all getting heat stroke. I mean, it was like 110 degrees and we were in the middle of nowhere in a Nevada desert. I mean, it was like everything was going wrong. But what we were doing was we were learning. So, we didn't know about the metallic in the soil. We wouldn't have known that until we took off that first time. We didn't know about the heat stroke. And like, I got to tell you, you get a bunch of like nerdy researchers who've spent the last 7 years in the lab out in a desert and you learn real fast, like what people understand about things like hydration. And the story ended up being this great success. The New York Times coverage was great. And I think it was because A, we'd given people a look behind the curtain. B, we were like, we're trying this for the first time and we don't know if it's going to work. And C, we didn't just sit there and like, throw the thing on the ground and like start crying. We all were like, okay, what's happening here? What can we do better? maybe we should just go back to the hotel and have some Gatorade and try this again at sunset. And, it ended up being one of my favorite stories to do because it failed, because we had that growth mindset about it. And we had that authenticity about like, yeah, this isn't going well. So does that answer that question or?
Yeah, it does. It does. Thank you. Brian, did you have a question?
Did.
Yeah, you. Yeah, no, maybe. No, okay. Yeah, awesome.
No, I'm just messaging my other colleagues here to
Okay.
get their insights on some of the content. It's really good. Thank you.
All right,
Oh,
awesome.
great. I'm so glad. Well, just to move on, I want to talk about seeing the impact. And I want to start this discussion of impact by saying, just to preface this, I've been at Microsoft for 6 years and I've been building on some of these stories for years and years. So when I'm showing you a bunch of slides of like some really fantastic coverage where our message really pulled through perfectly and we came off looking fantastic, just understand this is years of work. So it's not like tomorrow. It's not like on my first day on this job, I wrote a great story about this underwater data center and people were like, this is amazing. It's like we built this kind of like muscle up, and we built it up through failures and successes. But so, take this with a grain of salt. If I think it's really fair to look at this and be like, well, we can't do that tomorrow. But I do like to talk about these kind of long-term successes because there are a few things that I think we've really learned about how we can be impactful with our innovation storytelling. First and foremost is that like we need to meet people where we're at. So people don't know about our business. They don't know really what a data center does. They don't really know what a computer does, to be honest with you. And so avoiding jargon, avoiding acronyms. I always say, talk to people like you were talking to somebody sitting next to an airplane who asks what you do for a living, right? Like you wouldn't throw a bunch of acronyms in their face and like, say that your work was like creating a best in breed technology. You would like tell them what you do. When you talk to somebody about the work that they're doing, think about the thing that you're going to tell your spouse or your partner when you get home that night. That's actually the interesting thing. So don't second guess your own gut instinct of what's interesting about a story. Use regular words and authentic quotes. I say this over and over again. When we talk to people, we interview them and we really push them to get out of that muscle memory of using jargon and to really use the regular words. And then we really push to use those quotes again, even if they're imperfect. So, what we talked about that sort of like failed sailplane story that worked out pretty well for us. I also often push people to let us use quotes in which grammar isn't perfect, the word choice is a little weird, because it shows authenticity. It shows that a real person was really talking about this in a passionate way. And those are the quotes that get picked up and remembered. So when you're thinking about like, how am I going to tell this innovation story in a way that lands? I think it's really important to be like really human, really normal. I talked about this a little bit before, but the power of imagery is so important in your storytelling. So if you have any way to illustrate real human emotion or really cool and funky looking tech, that is going to take it a long way. I mean, this picture over here of the underwater data center, what I love about this picture is, this is one of our scientists coming out of like, he's got his whole thing on, he just climbed into the data center and he looks so happy because his research paid off and that emotion really comes through. This other story about accessibility, it was an example of a story of using a HoloLens to help people who are blind and low vision. And, these aren't like perfect looking people. They're not supermodels. They're just regular people who are having an impactful experience with technology. So, the storage on glass story I talked about earlier, people really wanted to see what the glass looked like. I was so surprised. This was the most used image. This this is what it actually looks like. And so, things like that are just really helpful for telling that story. And again, don't expect, Daily Mail coverage the first time you come out the door. This is a slow building journey. And you're going to start by telling smaller stories, bigger stories, and then you're going to land that coverage. Any questions about impact before I move on?
I don't know if it's directly related to this, but looking at these stories and a couple of the others, I noticed that I think all but one, there's a project name. Like obviously Project Silica and DNA Drive. How important is that for communicating, and how much time does that just naturally evolve, or is there your team sitting in a corner somewhere kind of formulating the perfect project name for these things?
I wish they would ask us, because sometimes the names come back and we're like, really? That was the one you chose?
Oh.
I do think from a from a branding perspective, it's important to pick a good name. And we do definitely go back to folks sometimes. What you see often in a project, especially if it's like a bootstrappy project that grew from within, those are the great stories to tell. But maybe the project name that you've been using internally it's like a joke, an inside joke. Maybe it's going to be offensive to people in other languages. So the first thing we do when somebody brings us a project name is we go to legal and branding and we say, hey, tell us if there's any concerns here. Tell us if there's, if this is going to be an offensive word in another language or culture. Tell us if this is going to translate badly. Tell us if there's another company that has this name they're using. And then we do try to influence that at that point. But I think it's also kind of fun, like Project Natick. A lot of our projects are Project City name. That's kind of a thing that we use. This underwater data center, that ended up being a phrase people really liked and glommed onto. So we just used it over and over and over again. Project Silica made sense because it's storage on glass, right? And so, I do think that it's important. I think that you can work with a bad name too, just making sure that it's not an offensive name or that your legal team is not going to get upset about it is, lessons I've learned the hard way in the past. And especially for those of us with companies with international audiences, that idea of offensiveness is so important. We just had one of those come up recently where, one of our international subsidiaries was like, just letting you know what that word means in slang in our language. We're like, oh, thanks for sharing. Definitely renaming that one.
I can share a little bit of more of my story. So you guys probably all heard about the Apple Card, right? The credit card by Apple. So it's actually backed up by the Goldman Sachs. And I was actually the person who was working on the models who would populate some of that credit underwriting and then taking that credit and securitizing it. So the internal name of the project was Project Cookie. I kid you not. and then when we're trying to actually change that exactly the same way, is like, okay, we cannot go out and say that our Apple Card product that is supposed to be this high level, super polished thing is named Project Cookie. So we literally in like 2 minutes we came up with the name Solaris, and that was our goal here.
No, that's a great example because Project Cookie is like really fun to say internally, but yeah, like people aren't going to understand that's a high-tech solution. Okay, so yesterday when Baz and I were talking, he talked about, could I dig deep into one story and talk about how you can successfully tell a story? So actually you haven't seen this one yet, but I changed the slide a bit because I decided to talk about a project called Custom Neural Voice. Just to kind of start, like the reason I wanted to use the story as an example of setting yourself up for success is because I think the biggest way you can be successful with innovation storytelling is to plan for it. Often our stories are literally years in the making, and this is a great example. So Custom Neural Voice is a technology that we use where you can take a body of data about a voice and then create other language around it. In this case, the customer that we were working with was AT&T. The voice was Bugs Bunny's voice. We started talking about Custom Neural Voice several years ago, at least 3 years ago. And the thing that we knew from the beginning is that it's a technology that has a lot of potential, and it's a technology that's going to be really concerning to people. So we needed to find the right way to talk about it, to both reassure folks that like we were using this technology responsibly and give them an example of it that would really like resonate with them and not seem like, a use of AI that might be challenging to some people. So it took us a long time to get there. And what I really appreciated about the team, the engineers and all those folks, was that they brought us along on that journey. So even though I didn't end up working with my team to write and publish the story until a couple of months ago, I knew about it from 2019 or 2018 even, I think. And they were just kind of giving me the updates a lot. And I would really encourage you as you work with storytelling teams, as you work to tell your story publicly or internally, to keep your storytelling folks apprised, even if it's not immediate. If you come to me 3 weeks before you're going to launch and say like, oh, hey, we've done this thing, then kind of my second point, we didn't get to be in the room where it happens. And that is so important for us as like reporters and photographers. I don't have this big, huge budget. I don't have a big production team. I don't have a marketing org behind me. We're this really scrappy group of people that are doing this storytelling. And the main thing we want is just to be sitting around when you're doing the things. And that's really hard in COVID. So, a lot of it is like, well, can you just invite me to the meeting and I can just be a fly on the wall? Or, can I just like get the notes from your, jam session if it's, if there's not COVID safe protocols, but really making sure that your folks are like seeing those genuine steps along the way. It's going to help with that jargon problem, with us being able to explain a story in a really, interesting way. It's going to sound super authentic because we're actually there for it. And on the photography side, it's just, we can't tell a story. We can't take a picture of something that we missed. We have to be there for it. So, thinking through that. The other thing I would say is like, this be authentic and tell the truth. And tell the truth sounds really obvious, but honestly, there's a lot of companies who are like, well, maybe we can shape it this way. My feeling about that is, again, we live in a world of social media. The more honest you are, even if you're acknowledging imperfections, the better. So with this story, with custom neural voice, we came out of the gate saying, this is a technology that's new and different. We understand the responsible AI implications. We don't have all the answers, but we're trying to find the answers. We're listening and learning. We're providing a very limited number of customers this technology to use in ways that we think are responsible, and we will always do it that way. So we were reassuring people, and we were also acknowledging the friction and the tension and the potential downsides. My feeling in our storytelling all the time is that we should front end. If we know somebody's going to have a question that will raise a negative concern, let's bring it up now, so we have a chance to pre-address that question, pre-answer that question. And then to get to the customer part, we talked a little bit about this earlier with Warner Brothers, but this was another great example of where we had a customer. They actually wanted to use custom neural voice to show how their 5G network worked. So AT&T in their stores wanted to be like, our 5G network is so awesome that you can run this really heavy AI model on it. But it happened to be that they chose custom neural voice, and they had Bugs Bunny speaking. And so it was like really everything coming together, where we had a customer who wanted to tell a story that was very complementary to ours. We knew we had something that would immediately resonate with customers. When you say custom neural voice, they're like, oh, what's that? When you say Bugs Bunny is going to talk to you when you walk into a store, that sounds really cool. And I just want to read, I wrote it down, but let me find it because my notes are all over the place. I want to read this quote from one of the AT&T folks, because I just loved it. He said, we're trying to prove to customers that there is something to 5G that makes it different and better than a 4G network, said Jay Carey, vice president of blah, blah, blah. It has massive computing power, higher speeds, and lower latency. This felt like a really amazing way to bring the potential of the network and the technology to life. And then our writer, I just love what she did with this, because she wrote, Bugs Bunny is the first animated character AT&T has brought to life with custom neural voice, but it won't be the last. Carey becomes quite animated himself as he talks about the possibilities. Characters coming to life from the cereal box, reading you stories, watching cartoons alongside you, or showing you around the neighborhood. We love that idea of blending the physical environment and the virtual environment, he said. And so, our writer, I think, did a great job painting this picture, but it was a really great example where we were telling an innovation story, but we weren't using deep technical terms. We weren't talking about deep neural networks. We were just saying, like, look at this cool thing that can happen. And those are often our most successful stories.
Allison,
Yeah.
a quick question here. So when you kind of say, right, that journalism approach, right, and the journalism approach is usually that you are a independent observer. You try at all costs not to intervene and not to sort of navigate this. But then, if you're part of the story, if you're part of the almost a working team from the very beginning, where do you draw the line? Where do you say that, okay, I'm just here listening and documenting, versus the point like, okay, stop. That's going to make a horrible story.
Don't say that. Okay, so definitely I say that we do journalism style storytelling. I'm a former journalist. Almost everybody on my team is a former journalist, but we're not abiding by the regular journalism rules, right? Like, we're very friendly interviewers. We're helping folks get where they need to be. We are influencing that in terms of like saying, this is the area we'd like you to talk about, choosing the quote that we think will, help further our mission as a company. When it comes to the writing style, however, you're not going to see us use a lot of adjectives. You're not going to see us like, pump our chest about how great we are. So I think of it in sort of two ways. One is, yes, we're observers, but we are also influencing it. And the way we're influencing it is often just kind of like trying to get to the part of the story that we will think will be most impactful. So I'm not telling them how to be engineers or how to develop their product, but I am providing that strategic guidance on what element of the story will resonate best. And then when it comes to the sort of like how we present it to the world, just really, really, really pushing to make sure that the story is written in a way that it feels a little bit like an impartial observer, maybe an excited observer, but an impartial observer. Because I think when you come out and you're like, hi, we've done this great thing, it's the best thing, yay us, it feels inauthentic. And while that might have worked, again, 20 years ago when we were all putting out press releases, that's just not the world we're in these days. It doesn't resonate with people. And also, we want to be plagiarized by journalists. So we want journalists to use our quotes and use our stories. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions here on this one?
Yeah, I was wondering, if you had to look at how much time you spend on storytelling, the marketing, the journalism piece versus the actual product development, knowing it's an impossible ask to get something exact. I mean, but what would you say the time ratio of the storytelling and marketing is compared to the product, the development or the build cycle prior to that
Yeah,
product?
it's a good question. I don't know how long it takes the engineers to build things, so I'm not in a really great position to say that. But what I will say is it's a lot of work. Yeah, I mean, we do about 24 stories a year. So, if to just give you an idea, with a team of about 7 people. So, we put a lot of effort into fewer stories. And I do think that that's part of sort of Microsoft's approach to communications, which is, sort of like, let's focus on the biggest pieces and put our resources behind those pieces. But it's not like every day, 40 hours a week, hang out with the team. A lot of it is like checking in with them. Like, hey, how's that going? Can I do a quick interview with you and see how this is going? Or can I send a photographer out to document this element of your work? And so like the time frame can be really long, but the hours of the day are not as long. But yeah, I mean, as a journalist, I wrote a story a day, right? Like I was pumping out 400 pieces a year and doing broadcast and doing this and doing that. And here, our goal is 24 with a team, so it definitely is time consuming work, but not, if you think about a staff of 7, like not a huge, again, we don't have a huge budget. And so almost everything is done by us. People are like, oh, who's going to be doing this, that? And I'm like, that's me. You're looking at me, I'm your person. Because I think it's also just like a kind of a scrappy way of doing business.
So
So the add-on question to that, I mean, when do you get involved into the product development? What stage of that product development do you start this storytelling interview process?
I mean, ideally, I at least find out about things earlier in the process if we think it's something that's developing well. But in terms of like developing the story, like a lot of it in those early stages, like it can be months. Like Project Natick is a great example where, months and months of them kind of being like, yeah, we're doing this, here's an update, oh, we finished the manufacturing and things like that, but not really being involved, just kind of keeping tabs on it until the real work starts happening. And then we're there, and then it's like, okay, we're going to be, you're going to hate us. We're going to be here for 3 weeks. We're going to get to know you really well. And I mean, honestly, like, especially when I do video, we really embed with people and they're like, oh, hi, you're still here. And we're like, yep, still here. Don't you like us? But we try to be nice. So yeah, like, I think it's checking in. And then at the crunch time, like, yeah, we want to be all in. We want you to be sick of us.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Allison, when you said 24 stories for the team of 7 during the year, is it 24 kind of like big stories such as, Project Matic, or is it 24 pieces of content?
Sorry, yeah, I should say 24 big stories. We also
Okay.
do a bunch of other stuff. We do like AI narratives. We do this thing called the Book of News, which is like, short summaries of every news thing we're having at events. We do, like sort of like quick hit little pieces. And, so there's a bunch of other stuff that happens, but when you think about like sort of our Project Natick or our Microsoft Mesh level announcements, we'll get to 24 of those. And yeah, I should clarify that probably represents about 50% of the work that my team does, because there is so much other work that, just other sort of communications that we do.
So those 24 stories, and I would assume that they go from year to year. So is it 24 stories because this is as much as you can crunch, or is it a conscious decision of saying, we don't want to overpower and saying,
Yes.
publish 2 stories every day for 365 days? So is it a resource constraint, or is it deliberate constraint to focus on the certain stories?
I would say it's mostly the deliberate constraint to focus on the certain stories and to put, we could put less resources behind more stories, but then to get back to that part about owning your story, then we just kind of start, randomizing people. So it's more of a deliberate effort to say, like, Microsoft Mesh is a, top priority for company. For those of you who aren't following our company closely, it was a recent mixed reality announcement. So that's something we're going to follow for a whole year and tell a really good story about, because we want that to land as an understandable key priority for the company, and like I said, there's a lot of times where we're going to say no. It doesn't mean that nothing happens at Microsoft around some smaller product announcement or whatever. It just means it's handled with a marketing blog, handled with an exec blog or things like that. So yeah, we're putting those big guns behind sort of our biggest bets that kind of continue to fulfill this broader innovation story we're driving. But yeah, it's very rare that I say no to somebody because of a resource constraint. Like, we find the resources if the story is the right story to tell. It's just that, again, there's not a lot of stories that even a company as big as Microsoft is doing that's really going to be that big splash.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so the last quick thing I want to talk about, because I want to get time for more questions, is just this idea of getting your story out into the world. This is a picture from this really cool AI thing that we did in our research lab, where this art display changed colors based on emotion. It was pretty neat. But in addition to kind of thinking through how we're going to tell a story, sometimes a year or two in advance, we're starting to think from the beginning of how are we going to amplify that story? How is it going to get out in the world? So, just today, for example, we began work on a story that will probably take us a year to tell. And the communications person we're working with said, how are you thinking about how this story will get in the world? And I was like, I'm so glad you asked. I feel like I trained you so well. So we're thinking about how are we going to create the right assets so that our social media team is going to want to use this story? How are we going to work with them to make sure that we get them what they need? How are we going to think about what channels is working on? Is it LinkedIn? Is it, Instagram? In this case, it was a really natural Instagram story because it was really visual. LinkedIn is usually a social media platform that we're thinking about from the beginning because that's where our business decision maker customers are, right? And are we thinking about media outreach? If so, what do we need to get to make sure that our media partners have what they need? If you're not thinking about all that stuff at the beginning, if at the end you go to your social media team or you go to your comms team and you're like, hey, here's this beautiful thing, they're going to be like, A, I didn't plan for this. B, this isn't what I need. And, C, I can't make this as successful. So everything that you do these days is just a tree falling in the forest unless you amplify it. So I just really encourage you to think from the beginning about how am I going to get this out to the world? Who do I want to reach? And if you're having trouble with those questions, it's also maybe a sign that this isn't one of your, how you're owning your story. Maybe this isn't the right story for it. We also are very scrappy about stuff. We'll if there's a customer who's like, hey, we love the story, what can we do? We'll be like, hey, post it on Reddit, drop it on whatever random, thing. We're just so shameless about how we get our stories out there because you kind of have to be a little bit desperate. And then I think on the self-promotion side, it's also really important to be true to your brand. I know this is going to come as a shock to you, but we're not the coolest company here at Microsoft, and so a flashy marketing campaign that's hey, look at us, it's just not really going to resonate because that's not how people think of Microsoft. So, I have definitely seen that happen where you see a company come out with a really flashy, really cool, Twitter campaign or something, but it's not on brand for them. It's not really who they are, and it just doesn't land well. So that's kind of the pitch on promotion and being a self-promoter. And I think that's something that's kind of the hardest muscle for companies who are kind of used to standing back and not talking about themselves, just really finding a way to be successful on that front.
So Elson, kind of a quick question here. So I have a younger sister, and she's obviously whatever she's I think Gen Z, right?
Okay.
And she's part of all of those consulting groups, and she's part of all of those professional Instagram accounts that are kind of work against banking or consulting and all of this. So have you actually partnered up with some of those more informal groups, some of those more informal organizations, right, that are really run more or less like a giant meme group or something like that? So have you done something like that?
That's not work that I have done, and to my knowledge, it's not work that our social media team does. I think we have focused more on traditional methods. Honestly, we have the benefit of a pretty strong social presence, so I wouldn't be opposed to it, especially if you haven't. If you look at if you don't follow our Twitter feed, you should follow it because it's mostly pictures of dogs and weird jokes about Excel with the occasional news thrown in. And so, we kind of have this brand out there, and I think that we've been able to capitalize on that. But I think if I was in a different place, if I was in a different company, I would definitely look at how can we partner with folks who know how to do this better than us. We just have, the luxury of a really fun and engaged brand social team. We have the luxury of executives who are really active on social media. And honestly, that can drive half our traffic. If we get Satya or Brad Smith or some of those folks to, share our stories on LinkedIn or things like that, that can drive a lot of traffic. And I should say here, page views aren't a metric that we look at very closely. We're not super interested in how many people read our stories so much as who those people were. So if you are writing a story and you're like, I really want like accountants to see that I'm innovative, like if that's your like the thing that you need to do for your business, then don't try to get 200,000 page views, try to get 2,000 page views, but all of those people are accountants, you know? And so, you know, really kind of being specific and measuring your success based on like whether you drum up new business, whether you change the hearts and minds of people you're trying to reach. A lot of our external comms on LinkedIn and stuff can be around recruitment, right? So we don't really care maybe about selling a product. We just want, you know, a potential employee to see it and be like, oh, I'd like to work there. You know, just thinking really clearly about what measures success is. That was a weird sentence ending.
I can maybe add on to that question and ask the same question more from an internal perspective. How do you measure employee engagement and kind of retention, if you will, of these stories, you know, going back to about whether that's for recruiting or retention, you know, keeping employees, you know, that from that perspective. And
you know, I'm so glad
internal hat on.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that, because internal comms isn't my particular area of business, but I partner with our internal communications folks as much as I partner with our external communications folks, because to your point, I mean, at Microsoft, we have 160,000 employees, right? So that is like, you know, a mid-sized newspaper circulation, right? Like that's a big group of people that you need to keep happy and that you want to be transparent with and that you want to reward with good coverage if they're doing great work. And so, you know, I guess I would say two things about that. We think of all of our external storytelling as having an internal component, right? Like part of telling a great story about a project Natick is to show our data center folks, hey, there's this cool innovation going on in your line of work. You should feel excited about that. You should feel excited to work at Microsoft. Part of it is transparency, like, hey, you know, we are trying all these different things in our data centers, and like, you know, we want you to be aware of them. We want you to feel like you're part of that journey. And then some of it is also like, yeah, I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. Even for a technology company, introducing new technology can be scary, and we don't want people to feel like we're taking away their job. We want them to really understand that every time we introduce a new piece of innovation or technology internally, the goal is to give them the power to feel, make them feel empowered to do better work, to do, you know, more risk-taking work, to try something different. And so, you know, how do we communicate our technology stories in such a way that our employees, who are also our customers, feel like, oh yeah, you know, if I'm automating this task, it's not because Microsoft doesn't think I'm a relevant person who should have a job here. It's because Microsoft doesn't think I should spend my time doing this mundane task. They think I should be spending my time on higher value work. So yeah, like our messaging for internal can be a little bit different, but we do use a lot of the same materials to try to get our internal employees engaged. Another thing that we use is an employee social sharing platform on LinkedIn. It used to be called Elevate, and they're just rebranding it. And if you haven't heard of it, I would really encourage you. So one thing that we found in trying to tell a cohesive story is that our employees are some of our best advocates. They're some of our best advocates for recruitment and retention, and honestly, just for like getting us, you know, to the right people. But their social sharing was kind of all over the map, and we were seeing some stuff that we didn't like, especially around like AI and topics that were tricky, some wording that we wouldn't use. So we started this like sort of suggested social sharing platform. So basically, like I write a story and then I write a suggested tweet and I put it on this thing, and any employee can come there, make it a little bit their own and post it. And so what we're doing is we're getting a really cohesive message across. We're making employees our allies and advocates, but we're not giving them the responsibility of knowing like, oh, what's the right wording to use if you're talking about responsible AI. And I would really encourage you to think about a way to do that, because then they also feel engaged in your innovation story. They feel like they're part of it. That was a really long answer. Yeah, sorry, Russ.
Oh, no, sorry about that. Just cut you off. I thought you were. This has been actually one of the toughest nuts that we've had to crack. If you take a look at our strategy for communication and communicating what we've been doing and the things we have done both internally and externally. So I appreciate your presentation. It's given us some insight, or given me some insight on things that we can try differently. And I actually answered my question, which was going to be on how do you modify your to handle the internal piece of the communications as well. So appreciate that. Is there anything else that you could recommend for a company our size when you look at communications with clients and from an innovation standpoint of telling the story? While we don't have the same budget Microsoft does on that, I think we have a pretty unique story to tell them. But sometimes I feel that maybe we're not doing a good enough job both internally and externally. I still, like I said, been one of the toughest nuts we've tried to crack.
Yeah. So remind me to get back to the resourcing part, because first I want to just talk a little bit about that employee part, because I think one thing that I was thinking as you were saying that is that sometimes also like effective employee communication is just like an email, right? So I recently was given the job of spearheading a new technology that our team was using, a new SharePoint technology. And I have to say, for a bunch of people that write about innovation, it was like the grumbliest group of people who were like, I will not switch from my like really inefficient system of sending 70 emails with attachments to a cohesive SharePoint system. And like, it was like 3 months of pain. And then we started to see the results, right? And somebody who mentors me, who's really helpful to me, who uses email really well, gave me some great guidance. And I started doing this like just every few weeks, sending an email to the team being like, thanks so much. I'm so glad you're using this tool, like killing them with kindness. And here's a great example of a positive outcome as a result of this new tool. So I guess one thing to keep in mind for internal communication is it can be splashy and formalized, and it can just be really informal and just reinforcing with your managers the value of saying thank you, the value of showing your employees the impact you see of their work every single day, and like acknowledging how hard it is, how change is hard. Again, like, I mean, this was so ridiculous, right? Like people were sending emails with attachments, like 50 emails on something. Instead, you could put it all in the SharePoint, sorry. And we work at Microsoft, we know this, right? And yet getting them there was hard. And that sort of like drumbeat of rewarding them for good behavior really worked. So to get to your other point about storytelling, your question about storytelling, I guess the first thing I would say is there are a lot of out of work journalists, and journalists have never made any money. So calling on journalists, freelance journalists, or people with a background in journalism to tell some of these stories. I mean, obviously I have a stake in that game because I'm a former journalist, but I think you would be surprised at how inexpensive it is to bring somebody with that journalism background in to consult with you or to work with you. I mean, the photographers and videographers that I work with come from that space. They're like a tenth of the cost of the fancy production studios. And often we get such a higher quality product in that it's more authentic. It's more like how we want to tell our story. So I'd really encourage you to consider that as an option for bringing in outside communications folks to do some of this work, as opposed to a really fancy, you know, bespoke marketing firm or something like that. It's going to cost you a lot of money. And then the other thing I would say is like, you know, if you think about the starting small goal, if you think about like, maybe we're just going to prop up a WordPress site, try a couple stories, tell some small stories, build on that, see if it works, acknowledge if it doesn't, you know, be comfortable with a little bit of failure. That can be a way to go. I don't want to sound, I recognize that I work for a really big company and that we have sort of a built-in sort of, you know, process for this, and that it's like really easy for me to stand here and be like, do all these things without any resources. But I do think that the value of starting small and the value of using, you know, the inexpensive labor of unemployed journalists can, you know, I mean, I have a videographer I work with who I used to work with at NBC who produces fantastic videos for literally a tenth the cost of the production studios that my team used to use.
Yeah, and actually, I want to add another my Goldman Sachs story, and I apologize for this, but nevertheless, I'm actually like I'm a semi-professional photographer. I was doing that in school and all this, and when I became part of the Goldman Sachs and people kind of learned about it, I just became an in-house photographer, and not only I did it sort of for free, but I also actually enjoyed it because I got to meet super interesting people. You know, I met our CEO several times, all this just because of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually it adds more to your company. You probably have bloggers in BDO. You probably have photographers in the BDO. You probably have videographers on the BDO. And they would be actually interested into trying to build those stories and get that creative outlet and that's actually one of the things that we keep hearing from like Silicon Valley approach, right? Is that look at the people more beyond their regular roles. What else is out there that they can bring to the table and you can appreciate them for?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And, you know, with COVID restrictions, we created this like selfie guide. Now, I will never say that asking people to take selfies replaces professional photography. I would definitely recommend either using your semi-professional photographer in-house or, you know, using a professional photographer. But we created this guide. We gave them really clear guidance. Here's how you light. Here's what you do. Here's how you don't look weird, right down to like, here's how you get yourself to smile in a way that doesn't seem strange. And honestly, we've gotten some pretty great stuff out of it and some pretty fun stuff too. Like people enjoyed it. And so, yeah, I mean, the kind of scrappy stuff, the better. I recently couldn't get into a data center and needed to do some data center storytelling. And I was literally on the phone with an engineer, walking him through how to take pictures and light them in a way that we needed, and like it works. I mean, and then they feel super bought into the process. They're so happy because they feel like they were part of the experience. So just don't annoy them, because if it's not something they want to do, then they're going to do it badly and they're going to feel grumpy.
Allison, do you have could you maybe talk a little bit, and I'm going to ask from the internal perspective this time, but what sorts of channels I mean, I can say that we have Yammer, we use Yammer. And you talked about email. I mean, what other sorts of, I don't know if channel is the right word or whatever, but we've talked about podcasts, videos, kind of a news reporter sort of approach. I mean, and I realize you partner with the internal communications, but it sounds like pretty closely. Kind of curious to your thoughts there and what you've seen work well and maybe not work well.
Yeah. We use Yammer as well. I think the great thing about Yammer is that it's employee driven, and the challenge about Yammer is that it's employee driven. So if you talk about owning your narrative, you can find that it devolves a little bit, into like strange discussions about like, why aren't we paying employees in Bitcoin or, whatever. And so, I like Yammer because I think it gives me a pulse of what employees are thinking about. I don't use it as a storytelling mechanism necessarily, for that. We do use emails, like we've had a cadence of COVID emails that have come from one executive at a predictable time. And I've loved that as a storytelling mechanism. And we've actually incorporated some of our own storytelling into those emails, like embedded videos from innovation that we've done around COVID and things like that. And I think honestly, like emails feels very old school, but it's very predictable and comfortable to people. And it's something they can engage with on their own time. So I think if you have a way of, kind of, again, finding the right spokesperson, the right executive spokesperson to tell your story, giving them a predictable cadence and building in some of these other assets, that can be really effective. I love podcasts for internal. I love podcasts. I think town halls and those sorts of things are great for getting employee engagement and getting, the Q&A kind of stuff and the rhythm of business stuff. Podcasts are an opportunity for executives and employees to see people in a different light or think about a different topic. Chris Capicella, our chief marketing officer, who's just, like one of those incredible people, he does a podcast. Some of them are public, so you can look at them on culture at our company. A lot of them are public, actually. He's talked to employees about fat acceptance. He's talked to employees about being on the autism spectrum. He's talked to employees about mental health journeys. I can't tell you how great that is. First of all, having an executive interview an employee about a topic like that really shows that as a company, you're trying to institute cultural change. Secondly, giving everyday employees a voice in that really safe space, I think really kind of like makes them feel empowered. We do podcasts in our research lab too, and same, like, it kind of is just a chance for the employees to see like, oh, there is really cool stuff going on here. And like, these are really interesting people. So I think it's a great option to think about. And I would just say, keep them short, 20 or 30 minutes, no 2-hour podcasts. Nobody's listening more than 20 or 30 minutes. So.
Thank you. It's super helpful.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I actually have a very quick question. I know you spoke to this a little bit before about the external messaging and about kind of not patting yourself on the back too much. But BDO is as a company that provides solutions from a service perspective, mostly to our clients. The story, it's one thing if we have a technology that will benefit our clients. I think we can make an easier link there. But in terms of, telling a story of how we are actually an innovative firm and getting that as kind of more of our branding out in the market is a little difficult when it's something that just benefits us internally. If we've created something that's streamlining our processes and yes, eventually it will help the clients. I'm just wondering if you've ever had any kind of experience with trying to bridge that gap between just showing how great we are, but also trying to communicate that we do have these abilities.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really tricky space to be in. And I definitely tread really carefully there, because you do want to be careful to not sort of just come out and be like, hey, we finally got everybody on Teams and now we are saving like 10% of productivity because people aren't sending files around. But that is really valuable. And it is something your customers and your clients should know about, because it means that their work is going to get done better. And so, I mean, I don't want to, like, I guess, speak specifically because I don't want to sound like I know what your business is when I don't. But what I would say is a couple things. Those are great stories to tell internally, of course, right? And they're great stories to tell to clients, maybe in a more like private environment, like come up with a narrative that you're saying to customers and pitches and things like that. I mean, I certainly see that happen at Microsoft, where it's, we're not coming out and telling a really big external story about a switch to, whatever, but we are trying to find ways to work that in. A lot of our cultural storytelling, for example, we talk about our changing culture to customers directly, but we don't do that publicly, because publicly it's a little weird to be like, hi, we're on a cultural journey. But when you talk to a customer and you're like, these are some of the ways that we're changing our culture, and it's going to make our company more innovative, and we're going to be able to provide a better service to you, that can be a really nice way to do things. I think sometimes too, we've had success telling stories about our own innovation through how we worked with a customer. So it's a tricky one, and it's kind of hard to pull off, but like, if you can kind of find a way to be like, we helped this customer do this thing, and part of the reason we're able to do that is because we have a new process, or we have a new technology, that can be a way to get there. But I do agree it's something to tread carefully on. I think it should not be a big part of your external storytelling. I think the main way that you you think your instinct is very right there, that the main way you can have success with external storytelling is by talking about how you benefited your clients and customers. And it may just be a little bit subtle about that. It comes through that obviously you've been able to do these beneficial things for your customers and clients because you're an innovative company. And that's just a little bit of a like slow burn. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Allison, maybe last question, if nobody has additional question. What are your personal metrics of success? So measures of success. How's your performance is measured internally?
Yeah, like why do I still have a job here? It's a really good question. It's measured on the mistakes I've made. No. Okay, so I talked a little bit before about this, that we don't really look at page views. Like, we're interested in page views, but it's not our metric. And so when I measure success, what I'm really looking at is, did I move the needle on the perception of Microsoft as an innovative company? We have some metrics that I, can't talk about publicly that look at that, but some things that I can talk about is message pull through. So we have a producer on our team that will go manually through all of our coverage and see, did the wording and the phrases and the art that we used in our story show up in coverage? Message pull through is a really key part. We look at like, kind of overall kind of like perceptions of innovation, and how did they ebb and flow around our cover, our events and things like that. And we're honestly like very honest with ourselves. If a story happens and it just doesn't land, the coverage isn't great, it didn't pull through, then we're like, well, that was a lesson learned. So we have to be really comfortable with the fact that we're not going to hit a home run every single time, but we have to be able to learn from that. We also look at some very specific kind of readership metrics that you would think would be, I don't know, maybe kind of weird, but like, for example, time on site. If I write a story that's 1,000 words and our time on site is 30 seconds, that says that I didn't engage the reader. I didn't tell a great innovation story. So I got to figure out how that number should be up around a minute 30 or 2 minutes. So, things like that. But yeah, like, we're not looking at page views like when I was a journalist. We're really looking at like perception change and long-term perception shift. So some of our internal metrics, maybe like a year, 2 years, 3 years.
Awesome. All right. That took us to an hour. So, so Allison, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming in and sharing the great work you're doing in Microsoft. And have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks so much for all these great questions. It was really awesome to talk with you all.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.